All right, welcome back. A live view now of Boston, and we're seeing some conflict there on the ground. Still unclear exactly what is happening, but we do see a number of police officers who are in black, who have their batons, they have helmets there, and then you see a number of people who have pressed themselves somehow up against the police officers there. We don't know what is being said on the ground, what inspired this. But with us now, CNN law enforcement analyst and former Secret Service official Jonathan Wackrow is on the line with us now. And maybe, Jonathan, you can better interpret for me what it is that we are seeing here. Were you able to see some of the images right before this shot right here, where there was pushing between people?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, at the start of the two protests, you know, the primary protest and the counter protest this morning, what you saw was really well coordinated efforts by law enforcement to keep these groups separated, and that's really the goal of law enforcement today, is to allow protesters to voice their free speech, but also in a peaceful means. What's happening right now is that you're actually seeing some of those groups commingle, and that's exactly what you don't want to happen. So police are really trying to get in the middle of that, so we don't have another issue like we saw last week, where the groups start clashing together.
So our best understanding of the demonstrations happening here, we've got one group identifying itself as a free speech coalition. We've got another collection of people who are saying that they are counter demonstrators in the name of unity and peace. And you're describing how police have tried to protect the rights of everyone assembling to keep these groups apart so that there would not be any conflict. And potentially what we're seeing here, as we see the officers who were mostly in black and kind of walking slowly there, pushing these crowds back. You're saying they are using themselves as a barrier, the police officers, a barrier, so as these these separate demonstrating groups do not come face to face and potentially then have a conflict with each other.
Exactly. You know, what they want to do is they want to create distance between the two groups physically. So again, we don't have physical altercations on either party clashing with each other. Oftentimes, police have different tactics that they use, but the primary goal is to really ensure that they can keep those two groups separated physically. So again, we don't have any physical violence from one side or the other. And talk to me about how complicated this is for law enforcement. Here's another view now. You've got some officers who are wearing, kind of a neon green vest, and you've got other officers who, are all in black with helmets. But talk to us about the real complication that, officers are tasked with, police forces are tasked with now by being able to do this when you've got thousands of people who are demonstrating. Absolutely. So when you start looking at, demonstrators and protesters, things can change rapidly. The situation is very dynamic. It's very fluid. The challenge for law enforcement is actually to get, real-time situational awareness of what are the groups doing right now. When two separate groups are together and contained, it's easier to get information and intelligence on what those groups are doing. Once they start dispersing and separating and trying to commingle with each other, it's a real challenge for law enforcement to, garner the situational awareness of what those groups are doing. So intelligence is key to the law enforcement and their action to, again, try to separate these groups.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jonathan Wackrow, for your point of view on this. It is a very fluid situation. We're all watching it as you're watching it at home. And again, there are what appears to be hundreds, if not thousands of people who have descended there on Boston for these demonstrations with different points of view. One organized group saying that they are there in the name of free speech. We had a couple of guests on earlier, one with the Southern Poverty Law Center, one who is a former skinhead who described that group or was familiar with the group naming itself the Boston Free Speech Coalition as a group that it says is one that cultivates fear. And then you have thousands of other people who have descended on Boston, who have been marching in the name of unity and peace, calling themselves counter-demonstrations. So, Jonathan Wackrow, as we continue to look at these images here, does it appear as though it is I guess this is so far considered a rather successful means of trying to control the crowd? All right, looks like we may have lost Jonathan Wackrow there, who is describing that police there are trying to separate the groups so as to prevent any kind of unrest. All right, our Polo Sandoval is there on the ground in Boston. He is also there among a number of demonstrators. Earlier, Polo, you were telling me that you were amongst counter-demonstrators. What are you experiencing now?
And Fred, we still are among some of those counter-demonstrators, and what we're seeing here is basically Boston police officers creating a circle here as they keep their faces in the crowd of counter-demonstrators. What we're trying to do right now is find out exactly what led to what is a relatively tense situation just southeast of Boston Common. What we do know, I watched that at least 8 people appear to be counter-protesters their hands were whip-tied by authorities, and then they were taken away, currently detained. What we're trying to find out is exactly what led to this. Several people in the crowd telling me that this may have been a point where some of the free speech demonstrators, as they call themselves, were essentially leaving the demonstration, and as a result, possibly went face-to-face with some of the counter-demonstrators. So, again, that's what you are able to hear in the background, police sirens, police officers. Things, while tense, are still relatively peaceful. Again, just a few arrests. Things still look under control here. But, again, authorities are keeping a very close eye on the crowd, keeping people at bay as they try to really get a hold of the situation and make sure that no other incidents happen here, Fred.
Right, and we were talking to Jonathan Wackrow, who said, you know, it's quite the undertaking for law enforcement there to try to keep these dueling, demonstrators apart, and that is part of the effort in order to best secure public safety. Back with me also, earlier I was talking to Michael Blake, Vice Chair of the National Democratic Committee, and Niger Innis, National Spokesman for the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Executive Director of the TeaParty.net. If you all are back with me too, I'd love to get your impressions of what we're seeing and continue our conversation. So Niger, earlier I had asked about what you were hoping the message that the President of the United States will be receiving by watching this large number of people who were demonstrating there in Boston.
I think the message is clear. First of all, I want to applaud the police officers in Boston and the leadership of the mayor and probably the governor of the state, a leadership that unfortunately was missing in action in Charlottesville. Look, in Charlottesville, you had 2 groups of extremists, or maybe multiple groups of extremists, that wanted to precipitate violence. Yes, you had the Klan, you had neo-Nazis, but you also had Antifa, which is an anti-fascist organization, a violent organization. Both of these groups wanted to precipitate violence. And what happened is the decent people of Charlottesville, both black and white, got caught up in violence that the police officers and the law enforcement and the political leadership of that city and that state failed to do anything about. It seems like Boston, by comparison, is doing something quite different.
All right, Michael.
So first of all, Niger's comments are absolutely outlandish and ridiculous for multiple reasons. Number one, let's make sure we recognize what he said in the previous segment, where he said that these are celebrating relics and that racism is on the sidelines, on the fringes, and actually also took a disrespecting shot at President Obama and the work that he did. As someone who had the honor of working for President Obama, as someone who represents the most diverse county in America, in the Bronx, who recognizes what's happening, let's see what's happening right here. Last week, you had individuals with torches that were showing up clearly promoting white nationalism and neo-Nazism to clearly come and create havoc on a community. The mayor of Charlottesville immediately responded. The governor of Virginia immediately responded. What did you have from Donald Trump? He said he had to wait for the facts before he would comment on it, despite saying he actually communicated with law enforcement. Number two, when you listen to Niger's comments right now, the first persons that he highlighted was law enforcement on the ground. Now, look, we have respect for law enforcement, no question about that. But a reason why there's such concern is you have a president of the United States who endorsed police brutality. And so you have people that are marching today that are marching for the purpose. Niger, stop. You made your comments earlier. I listened respectfully. When you have individuals that are out there marching,
respectfully too, but what you're saying is laughable.
When you have individuals, it's not laughable, Niger. That's the problem. The fact that you find it laughable that people talk about endorsing police brutality as he did, that's exactly one of the reasons why people are marching. They're marching for love. They are marching for unity. They are in Boston.
Police brutality.
And let's be clear, Niger. Let's be clear. Let's tie this together. The reason why people are mobilizing, forgive me, Fred, the reason why people are mobilizing out there today is they said we want to come together to move forward in a positive direction. We reject hate and racism and bigotry, and to have this false equivalency of saying that people that were standing up against that were equally at fault as neo-Nazism is absolutely outlandish. That's why, again, 160 activities are happening around the country called Rise and Organize to say, let's come together in a positive manner, and rather than promoting discriminatory language and actually communicating that racism and the activities of that are on the fringes, let's see what's happening right here, right now.
Okay, so hold on for a moment, gentlemen, because I want to bring in Sarah Seidner, who's also there on the ground there in Boston among demonstrators, and I want to get her point of view and sentiment from the demonstrators there that are near her. Sarah.
So we're in an interesting position. This is Boston Common, the oldest park in America. On my left, there is a huge group of Black Lives Matter people who had basically set this whole thing up, organized it. But to my right, it's a lot of the anti-fascist and that group that also helped to organize. And we're going to kind of walk into the crowd here. You're hearing a lot of sirens. The police, we understand, have come in, and some of them have riot gear on. But really, right now, it's peaceful. I mean, for the most part, you're hearing speeches, people talking about how they feel about America right now in light of what happened in Charlottesville and in light of some of the comments the president has made this past week. You're hearing a lot of chants and a lot of cheering, but we did have one moment where things seemed to get filled with a bit of tension. There was someone who, from the quote-unquote free speech rally, came and started, I think, talking to protesters. Police kind of pulled him away, and they were literally running after him saying, "Get out, we don't want you here." But they were also telling people not to engage. And that was one thing that I thought was remarkable, is that you have crowds of thousands of people, and they're saying, look, don't engage with people, don't let them make you angry. Stand up against racism, stand up against sexism, stand up against white supremacy, but don't be violent. And so far, that's exactly what has happened here so far. Fred? All
right, thanks, Sarah. Polo Sandoval, not far from you. Polo, what's happening from your perspective?
Hey, Fred, still at one of these intersections here, just southeast of Boston Common, so not too far from where Sarah is, but I can tell you this was the scene of what was a fairly tense moment here a little while ago as some of these, quote, freedom of speech protesters, free speech demonstrators were essentially leaving the area, and that's when they got a little bit too close to some of the counter-demonstrators. So as a result, Boston police and other authorities having to intervene. At one point, we did see at least 8 who appear to be counter-demonstrators get placed on the ground and in zip ties and then taken away by authorities. So now what we're seeing are police both on motorcycles and police officers and on bicycles blocking the area here. I want to take you back to yesterday when we heard from the Commissioner, William Evans, saying that they're going to be taking a, quote, discreet approach at law enforcement here, meaning that they basically were going to rely heavily on cameras, undercover officers, the uniform officers, crowd. However, if things escalated, that they would immediately activate Plan B, which was, in essence, or at least short, some of these riot police officers, and that's who we're watching right now make their way towards the park, basically just making sure that things don't get out of control, which, again, compared to what we saw about 30 minutes ago, are relatively calm after those arrests were made. But, again, we're just southeast of Boston Common, where several people have already been placed into custody, and these so-called street demonstrators have left the area.
Thank you so much, Polo. Also with me, law enforcement analyst and Deputy Mayor of Rochester, New York, Cedric Alexander. And so, Cedric, as we look at these images, and just moments ago, we saw how police used what appeared to be an extraordinary technique of being able to keep demonstrators apart, meaning you've got one set of demonstrators, and then you've got counter demonstrators, and the objective by the city there is to help help prevent any kind of conflict between them by keeping them separated. Talk to us a little bit more about this image that we saw earlier, and we saw it unfolding live, how the officers in black there, and then accompanied by officers who are in the neon green, were using their bodies and I guess their arms and batons to keep people separated. Talk to me about that technique.
Well, what you'll find in situations like that, I can only imagine, is that those uniforms generally may represent a very different role that each of those officers may play. But I think what's very interesting about what's occurring in Boston, and I think it was just spoken about a moment ago, there's a lot of undercover officers that are there on the scene. They have a relatively, probably not too much of an exposed group of officers that are in uniform, but they're able to respond whenever they need to as it relates to a specific situation. Here again, as it goes back, Frederica, to what I was saying earlier, Boston has had a variety of experience in these types of situations. They have a very seasoned police department, they have very seasoned leadership, they have a very strong mayor there, and they certainly are going to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to exercise their First Amendment right, but they're going to take all precaution to make sure that no one is hurt. And so I applaud them for the work that they're doing. But here again, I would say to the spectators that are out there is that everyone should make sure that they police each other and conduct each other in a very peaceable way, which is their right under the First Amendment.
And I wonder, Cedric, do you have any concerns or thoughts about the crowd police ratio?
Well, certainly in many cases you probably will never have enough police that will outnumber people, but this is about methodology, this is about rehearsal, this is about practice, this is about knowing that generally in a large crowd you will have a certain percentage of those people that may get involved in something more violent, but generally not the entire crowd itself, because many people will seek safety and will not extend themselves. But what's important here is that in your community where police are outnumbered, it becomes an important piece for community members to make sure that they cooperate, they do as the police ask them to do, and they be eyes and ears, because there are people out there who truthfully want to peacefully protest. But here again, none of us are going to have any patience with hatred or violence or any type of nationalism that suggests that one group of people are better than another. This nation is not going to stand for that. And those who are standing out there and who are participating today in opposition of that, they have a right to be there, and they have a right to push back on any kind of hatred, as we all do in this country.
So again, for folks who just might be tuning in, there were, we understand there to be dueling demonstrations there in Boston. One group calling itself the Boston Free Speech Coalition, which describes itself as a coalition of libertarians, progressives, conservatives, and independents. I had a couple of guests on earlier today, one who is a former skinhead and one who's a representative of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who said that this group is known to cultivate fear, and that is one of its objectives. that group and demonstration being met by counter protests, people who say they were there in the name of peace and unity. We understand from our Sarah Seidner reporting that Black Lives Matter organized it largely. It is multicultural, multiracial, and you are seeing thousands of people who have turned out in the streets. Now we understand from police, according to the Boston Police Department, they have just tweeted that the free speech rally is over, and that that group is dispersing now, but there continue to be hundreds of thousands, perhaps even people continuing to be in the street who represent largely the counter protesters. So that one rally is over does not necessarily mean that, the city and police would feel like, okay, job over. Talk to me now about, I guess, this transitional period, if you will, about what law enforcement is tasked with as people disperse.
Well, certainly what's going to happen, the authorities there are not going to leave until the last citizen has left from out there. So when you have a larger crowd as you have there today in Boston, it certainly does take a little time for people to walk back to their cars, go to bus stops, or wherever they're going back to in order to disperse. So they will linger around, and you'll probably see some lingering. But what you will also see is a police department that will be there until the last person have left, and they will encourage people mildly that the event is over, and they will show restraint and patience. But of course, if there are those who just refuse to leave, then I'm quite sure they will take the appropriate steps that they deem necessary under the circumstances that they will see or experience.
Okay. All right, Cedric Alexander, thank you so much. We'll talk again very soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Again, it's the 2 o'clock Eastern hour. We continue to watch the assemblage of thousands of people in Boston. Boston police say the group known as the Boston Free Speech Coalition, which had a planned and permitted demonstration. That demonstration has ended. You're looking at images from earlier today, which appear to be part of the crowd control task of the Boston police. They were trying to keep members who were demonstrating on with one spirit and keeping them from interacting with demonstrators of another spirit. Also, there were counter demonstrators counter to the Free Speech Coalition who were there in Boston. They're in the name of unity and harmony. So again, we continue to watch even as demonstrators disperse. Still a lot of people on the street, and still you're seeing Boston police and the city at work trying to keep the harmony in that city. Our Polo Sandoval is there on the ground in Boston. Our Sarah Seidner is also there in Boston. First, let's go to Polo Sandoval and what's happening from your vantage point.
Well, Fred, earlier the challenge was just to keep these dueling protesters separated, and now it's about getting folks to eventually disperse. So as you can see, riot police here, the members of the Boston Police Department are now walking the streets because, as you mentioned, they took to social media a little while ago, in essence saying that this free speech rally is over, which was scheduled to end at 2. So everything seems to be on schedule. However, we have seen a few tense moments, including just down the street, as what we're told was some of these quote-unquote free speech demonstrators that were being led out of the area then potentially came face-to-face with some of these counter-demonstrators. So as a result, police officers really having to shift into high gear to stand between these two individuals. In the process, we've counted at least 9 people been detained, appear to be counter-demonstrators as well. So again, that's what's happening right now in the streets of Boston, just southeast of Boston Common, where you are still seeing hundreds of people, mainly counter-demonstrators, still lingering in the streets. So now that one challenge is over, the next challenge for law enforcement here is clear the streets.
All right, Polo, thank you so much. Let's check in now with Sarah Seidner. From your vantage point, what are you seeing?
there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of counter-protesters here. You've got the anti-fascists here. They're pretty much breaking out. That crowd did a few speeches, people cheered, and then they decided that they were sort of done and people can hang out in the park if they like. But you do still have a large contingent of the rally that was organized by Black Lives Matter. We are walking over to that right now. And just to give you a little bit of history, Boston Common, as you know, is the first park ever to be created in the United States, officially, if you will. And so it has a historical meaning to those who are here in Boston and to Americans as a whole. This place right now is the scene of what was two different demonstrations. One, the so-called free speech demonstration. And one of the things why people were upset about that demonstration is because one of the speakers listed, who was supposed to speak for that free speech, so-called free speech rally, had also spoken in Charlottesville during the white supremacist rally. And so people saw it as basically a different name for a racist group. The group itself has said, look, we organize this and we are not racist. We are just here to be able to express our views, and everyone in America should have that chance, but that is not how it was seen by obviously thousands of people in Boston who have gathered here. I do want to talk about something that happened about 10, 15 minutes ago. There was a rally from the crowd. All of a sudden you saw people running towards a gate and a street, and what they were saying was they were chanting, don't engage, don't engage. And it's remarkable because you've got thousands of people here. The person who was being detained by police was from the free speech movement, and you saw him sort of walking through the streets, and then you saw the Black Lives Matter group saying, look, don't engage, they don't want to see violence. An interesting juxtaposition there as you're watching this all go down. I do know that there have been some from the counter-protests who have been in the streets and police trying to push them away, some of them being detained as well because they want to keep the streets clear. But all in all, this has been a peaceful rally, a rally filled with people who wanted to show the world what Boston is about, a city that has had a long history of a racial divide and racially charged issues here. Frederica?
All right, Sarah Seidner, thank you so much. All right, let's talk more about some of the tense scenes that we were seeing, a collection of, hundreds, if not thousands of people. Cedric Alexander is the deputy mayor of Rochester, New York, and a former police chief. Paige Pate is a CNN legal analyst and a constitutional attorney, and Tanzina Vega, CNN's national reporter for race and inequality, and Jonathan Wackrow, CNN law enforcement analyst. We've got a huge panel here. All right, so Cedric, let me begin with you. As a former police chief, how do you think Boston is doing so far in trying to maintain the peace there?
Well, I would certainly believe in comparison to last weekend, they're doing an exceptionally good job. They had an opportunity to plan. They have experience in managing large crowds for a number of reasons over the years there in Boston. And certainly you're going to always have a few people that you're going to have to contend with. And maybe even arrest, but all things considered, up to this point, they seem to be managing things very well from all the indication of the reports we're receiving. But it is a very tough and difficult job for them because they have the responsibility of making sure that everyone has an opportunity to exercise their First Amendment right peacefully. But in addition to that, they also have to be ready to step in if there's indication or suggestion or intelligence that would indicate that things need to come to an end.
And Jonathan, you did a great job earlier describing what you were seeing and helping us understand what we were seeing when we saw, police in all in black with their helmets and then using their bodies, and also they had batons. They weren't, hitting anyone, but they were holding them up to help maintain a distance between demonstrators. So we're looking at that image again. One more time, if you could describe for us the technique there and why that is so effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, the primary goal is when you have a protest and a counter-protest groups that are converging on each other, law enforcement will always, the methodology is to get in between those two groups and try to keep them separated. Listen, it's to keep them separated from physical violence. While still allowing everybody to express their, First Amendment rights of free speech, law enforcement wants to ensure that through that expression, there's no ability to, from one side or another, to enact any violence upon each other. So, really great job today by law enforcement. They've had a little bit of time to plan for this. and really talk to the different groups that they knew were going to be present today. So I think real great job by the law enforcement, up to this point in time. But right now, the official events are over. So this is a critical moment for law enforcement, because as the groups disperse, what you don't want to happen is for pockets of individualized violence to occur between these groups around the city. And all of a sudden you start dispersing your law enforcement assets across the city. So critical time right now for the Boston Police and the Massachusetts State Police to gather intelligence, understanding where the groups are going, ensure that there's still separation and that no violence occurs citywide.
Okay. And then, Paige, one of the demonstrations was billed as a free speech rally, and then you had counter-protesters who said they were there in the name of unity. So when you hear from some of the folks who were part of the free speech rally, if some of their jargon is free speech is under attack, it's under assault in America, and that's why they are there, what is the case? Is free speech in trouble?
Well, we're seeing it play out across the country, and I don't think it is at all in trouble. In fact, I think what we're seeing with the protesters, the counter-protesters, is exactly how free speech is supposed to work in the United States. What is not supposed to happen is when it crosses over into violence. So the things that you're hearing from these protesters, the folks that came out into the free speech protest, it's disturbing to many people, and it creates very raw feelings, and you can understand that temptation to push back. But as long as both groups can remain peaceful, they both have a right to say what they want. Even if you don't defend what the people on the freedom of speech side are saying, I defend very much their right to say it.
Right, so the issue of hate speech is protected.
Yes.
Freedom of speech, it's a very big umbrella.
Absolutely. You cannot regulate the content of the message. Now, you can regulate and you can punish when that message goes beyond expression, when it goes into threats of violence, enticing other people to violence, pushing back physically against other counter-protesters. That is criminal act, and you can punish that. But the message itself, even if it's full of hate, you cannot punish it as a crime.
And is it your view that we had a guest on earlier who said, some groups are cloaking themselves, with the names of constitutional rights, and it's very deceiving, and that is problematic too.
Well, it's not deceiving if they're going to limit their message, to an expression, and not to a threat of violence. Now, when you see a protester walking down the street talking about free speech, having a hate-filled message, and carrying a firearm or using a threat to injure someone who's in the crowd, that's problematic and that's a crime. And that's what Cedric's talking about. These police are out there watching for that, trying to prevent that from happening. But you cannot criminalize the message itself, no matter how distasteful it is.
And Tanzina, how much of what we're seeing in Boston today, the spirit behind any number of people's motivation of being there, how much do you believe that is kind of a microcosm of what is happening across this nation?
I mean, I think what we're seeing, and to a large extent, are also fringe groups, particularly what we saw down in Charlotte's group, et cetera. That's not to minimize their impact or their importance as part of this conversation, unfortunately. What I think is interesting is this, and I agree with Paige, is this sort of revival of American civil disobedience in many ways. This is something I think a lot of generations haven't seen for quite some time. And so we're seeing this resurgence and this revitalization. We saw it with the Women's March. We saw it with Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and we're seeing it now with these demonstrations. And I think it's exactly that point, that if we can have these rallies and these protests where we're not losing lives in the process, and that essentially underscores our right to do that. But at the same time, we are also at a moment in American history where we are re-examining and really taking a deep look at where we stand as Americans on critical issues of culture and really of our democracy.
And is there a feeling, perhaps, Cedric, that this is the beginning of fairly regular, demonstrations of this caliber? And if that is the case, that even law enforcement is starting to reevaluate how it will tend to these?
Well, if these are going to be events that's going to expose and push back against evil and hatred, in superiority of someone feeling because they're from another race, then I'm going to tell you something. In this democracy that we live in, then we should stand up and have a voice, because it should not be accepted. It should not be allowed to be kept dormant anymore. And I think if President Trump has done any one particular thing, he's allowed this nation to actually confront this vile racism and hatred that is taking place. And as we begin to talk more about it, as we confront it, as we learn to deal with it, hopefully it'll make for a better nation, because this is something I think that every panelist there, and yourself, Frederica, knows, is that when it comes to issues around race and fairness and impartiality, we've been struggling with that in this country for a very long time. So if nothing else, what these rallies are saying, and what it's all making us very conscious of, whether we want to be conscious of it or not, we're not going to accept the fact, we're not going to escape the fact. It's an issue that still need to be dealt with. And those who spew that type of hatred, we all as Americans, black, white, men, women, gays, Jews, whoever, none of us are going to stand by any longer, and people are going to have a voice. But we have to do it in a legal and lawful way.
All right, we're going to leave it right there for now. Stay with us, my panel. Thank you so much. We're going to continue to monitor the situation in Boston as crowds disperse. We'll be right back.